Good morning. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter, voice of awakening and consciousness transformation guide, bringing you this week's Living the Shift live stream podcast. And today I want to talk about something that, we're in the midst of the holiday season, and what's in the middle of all of this. And it's really interesting because was another week where I was like, oh my goodness, it's Thursday morning and time to do my podcast. What am I talking about today? And there's no shortage of it, but meditation, I just started getting all this stuff and all these layers. And one of the things that is really important, and it comes up now because we are actually, in the midst of holiday season where there are many, many holidays. And within the holidays are very many traditions. And this is actually opening up a huge can of worms. It's actually really sort of funny because we don't realize how much we get lost. So really, we look at tradition as something that keeps us connected, keeps a practice going. And we see certain benefits to it. Right. But what's really important is also to see that sometimes we lose the purpose of tradition for tradition's sake. Hi, Anna. And so it's so funny because I keep on seeing all these layers. I mean, we talk about marriage. Marriage is a tradition that we haven't rehashed and recreated in so long. Right. And it's really outdated in terms of where we are today, in terms of understanding and consciousness and everything else. And I could do an entire week just on relationships alone. But what is also important to talk about is when we go through, periods like this, when we have all these traditions going on during the holiday season, many forget what the tradition is about. Like many forget why we do things. And we just get into this habit. So what I always tell people is habits can be detrimental and limiting, especially in our spiritual journey, because we sort of take things for granted. We don't do them. We stop doing them consciously, right? A friend of mine who's a hypnotherapist would talk about, she talks about how many times, like if you're taking the same path home and you've lived in the same place for like 20 years, how many times that you get home and you're like, I don't even remember driving most of the way home. That's this habit. And so, we could say that's a loss of consciousness. So if we're moving forward into a place of evolved, open consciousness, then wouldn't it serve us to just be conscious of everything we do instead of continue with tradition for tradition's sake? And I see that happening all the time. So, many people like, who practice Christianity, right? They celebrate Christmas and they don't realize that Christmas is like 90% pagan in terms of all of the traditions. Also, that Christmas was moved to December, because if you look at what the Bible says or whatever, that Jesus was actually born like in March, April, that kind of time frame. Anyway, so many people don't even realize that there are so many traditions that we have that. So, and what happened was when the Christians were trying to convert a lot of people, they would adapt certain pagan tradition, Druid tradition and every other kinds of tradition to try to help really it was a recruiting project, right? So so they would incorporate some of the practices of the other belief systems to get people to be softer about converting. So there's a lot about that. And that's Christmas, it's Easter, but it's not even, we have so many things that go on. Hanukkah is another one. We have the same practices and many times what happens is in getting in the habit of it, we lose the meaning. And so we have like glorified tradition and then lost why we liked the tradition to begin with. So if we take everything off autopilot, it's sort of like being on autopilot, which means that we're not conscious of everything we're doing. There are many people who, I've worked with who go to church, they go to temple or practice some kind of belief system, who I say to, why they're like, well, I still go to church, or I still go to temple. And then I'll be like, okay, and how do you feel about that? Well, it's what my parents did. It's what I was taught. Or people who've never walked inside a church have a child and feel like they have to get them baptized because their family expects them to. All these kind of things are traditions that don't necessarily serve us if you don't believe in them, if they don't hold an energy of belief that comes from the heart, from the individual practicing it. Same thing with energy work, with what we want to call intuitive or spiritual practices. This goes across the board, right? So like we're talking about this, but it really gets incorporated into so many things that we do, that we give so much more credence to something that's been around for like 3,000 years, right, than something that came up like a week ago. Right now, it's really funny because I've had that sort of some discussion about that over the years. I started the Trinity Energy Progression practice. It came into me in 2011, so it's going on, well, it's 7 years old now. So, but then it's like, and it goes beyond where a lot of traditional practices go, but there's all this question of, well, this has been around for this many years, and I'm like, except that part of our allowances, and we don't even have to name anything. We don't have to name, like we have this habit of putting things in boxes and giving them a name or a label. But then as soon as we give them a name or a label, we sort of trap it into a certain, we tended to trap it into a certain reality, a certain existence. And then we create a tradition around it. We create habits around it that cause it to sort of get ingrained and anchored. But sometimes it becomes like a tree, which is good in terms of anchoring, but then it's maybe not so good if we're moving forward and then our feet are stuck in the ground and not able to change, right? Because many, many times we resist change because it's different than the traditions. It's different than what we grew up with. It's different than what our families taught us. It's different than what our cultures have taught us. And so we adhere to them. And then the longer we adhere to them without looking at them and examining them over and over to say, do I still resonate with this? Does this still resonate? Do I feel this in my heart? Do I identify with it? Is this a part of who I am? Unless we reassess it constantly and every year, all the time, the importance of reassessing everything we do as, does it still serve me? Do I still resonate with it? And we're so out of the habit of doing that. So I talk about these practices and belief systems and all that kind of stuff. But we also have, like I was saying in the very beginning, marriage is another one. It's a tradition that is very outdated in terms of where we are today culturally and in consciousness. And yet we still try to perpetuate the traditions, even if they don't make sense anymore and we don't sort of feel them. And when we look at things from higher consciousness, where does that fit? Where does this kind of picture fit? And I work with a lot of people, and the reason that this is an important topic today is that many of us are holding ourselves back because of deeply instilled habits of tradition that we don't realize we haven't, we don't realize that we've outgrown. We don't realize that we don't resonate with them, right? So it's funny because it's always been a natural thing for me. As you know, and I don't really refer to this as much, but if you want to look at, people look at astrology and different tools and all kind of stuff. I mean, I'm an Aquarius, and Aquarians tend to, the Uranus kind of energy, it's very blowing away the tradition. Like, like what's tradition? There's no need, no such thing, right? So I've always been sort of like the rebel in that of like, well, let's look at that. But the thing is, in consciousness, as we move forward, constantly is, does this work for me? Constantly, what's important is to say, does this work for me in expanding my journey? So we have so much bias in the ego, and when we talk about spiritual journeys and spiritual expansion, we say, okay, so I've practiced this for 5 years. I've practiced this for 10 years. I've practiced this way for 10 years, right? Or 20 years or 40 years. So it's a deeply ingrained habit because that's the way I've done it for all this time, right? And so the interesting thing is, everything is the basis of what I teach is that it it's always important to allow ourselves to continuously expand, right? Because what we're doing is we're getting rid of all the things that are limiting us so that we can step into that remembrance of divine purity, divine power, our divine bliss that we came here to embody. And part of the journey is getting out of our own way. Well, the biggest part of our journey is getting out of our own way. So when we put everything on autopilot, we sort of get lost in the, what am I, you get lost in, okay, I do this and I do this and I do this and I do this. And what happens is we get this bigger and bigger and bigger pile of stuff that are habits that are ingrained that we just simply do on autopilot. And we know underneath, or as our consciousness like expands out back to our natural state of this divine wholeness, that we know this is limiting us. We know at some level that it is holding us back, and yet we still hold on to it. And why is that? Because something that has become such a tradition or such a habit then gets incorporated into our identity. It gets incorporated into how we perceive ourselves. And it also then becomes another lever of, well, other people, if I practice this, other people will think this way of me. And that also then perpetuates the externalization of our value to the judgment of others, right? So a lot of times we do these things, we stay in traditions, we stay in habits that don't serve us anymore, individually, in a familial way, in a cultural way, because we feel like as long as we perpetuate it, it helps us to belong, right? So it helps us to belong and be loved and worthy and all that kind of stuff. So part of the message for today, though, has to do with always question everything you're doing, and is it allowing you to move forward in expansion? Hey, Colleen, and Jen says fluid, flexibility, allowance of change, big message. Yes, big message lately, because we're constantly changing. And so probably the reason that this came into me to talk about today is because we are quick to grasp onto things that seem new and exciting in many ways, as long as we can hold on to these traditions. And we don't even realize what we're holding on to, right? I mean, we get into things and we talk about OCD stuff and we have to do things this way. Every year you practice Christmas this way, you practice Hanukkah this way, or you practice, whatever your practices are. We do this tradition this way, right? We do, we had such an interesting, we've had so many things in my family as I have, gone through my adulthood, on other family members becoming offended because my husband and I refused to follow tradition. We wanted to sort of create our own and what worked for us. But that's, that was always okay with me. And it's like, well, and it was always okay with us. And these are just little things. We're just talking about one little holiday, right? But if you talk about the bigger things that we're in such a huge habit of perpetuating, right? Which is marriage and sex, gender roles. What else? Yeah, spiritual practices, belief systems. They're all equal in terms of, even down to how we live, right? How we're expected to live, or what kind of life I'm supposed to live, right? I'm supposed to live, what I'm supposed to do. I've worked with a lot of clients through things like, we've actually, in this culture, we've gotten to a place where we we are expected to go to college, right? That's pretty much a standard that's become across the standard in the country, in the United States. And so I've worked with a lot of clients who have children who, because they're in a different part of awakening and spiritual awareness, that are just doesn't serve me, because the educational, guess what? That's another tradition we've yet to update that does not serve us or resonate with us anymore in terms of expansion and consciousness, which is our entire education system. So as kids, younger individuals are coming up through the system, and they're like, this doesn't resonate with me. I hear about more and more people going to alternative schooling methods, homeschooling and things like that, because the school system just doesn't attend to the energy and the focus of the child. And so they're trying, we still try to fit the children into the box of like what we used to be taught, but then we're still changing stuff, right? So it's really interesting that we have like, oh, that's a tradition in itself, right? Oh, you go to school, well, you go to college, right? Well, the kids are getting to this place where they get through school and it's like exhausting for them to get through high school because they're faking their way through because it doesn't resonate with them. And then it's like, well, why am I going to continue on in this facade? Because I don't even know how to be me because I'm being forced to be somebody else. And it doesn't feel good because the energies of consciousness as the younger children, as the children and young adults have come in, the biggest shift, and no matter what you want to call it, whether you want to call them crystal children or rainbow children or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. It's a shift. And as we're progressing, and generationally, it's like those who are coming in, I would say those like probably that we call the millennials and younger, sort of have come into a world that they didn't come in here to be in. It's sort of like, my understanding is that they came here to be in a world that hasn't been created yet or is being created as we go. And so it's really confusing. It's caused a lot of the issues and the identity issues and the rebellion issues and all that kind of stuff. And it's getting even more so with the kids, the younger ones that are coming in now, because they're coming in wide open. And not only are they coming in wide open, but they're staying wide open. And the reality they're living in is so completely different than what we're still trying to teach, like in school systems that we've had for like, whatever, 100 years. It's like, it's crazy to think that we're still trying to teach school the same way. Hey, Ann. So like, that's another thing. And so question everything. So the key for our expansion and moving forward and that flexibility, like what Jennifer said, fluidity, flexibility, allowance of change, is actually saying, like, let me look at this and does it serve me, right? And I tell people all the time, they're like, well, what about going to church? What about belief systems? And, like people who are in, more free-flowing spiritual belief systems, judge belief systems. I'm like, what? Everything serves somebody until it limits them. So if it helps to expand you to a certain point until it limits you, well, that's great. But then as soon as it starts to limit you, the key is to say, okay, time to find something else that helps me to expand, helps me to more, be who I authentically am, to step into my divine truth and be my divine bliss, or however you want to look at it. So, it's important for us to start looking at everything we do. One of the conversations I have all the time with my mother is like about like family members, like biological family members. And, that's another tradition. It's like, oh, well, you're supposed to have this kind of relationship with family and, only this kind of relationship with friends. And it's like, except that when we get beyond the labels, who are we? We're all just one divine consciousness connected. And by the way, like those people who I resonate with in my heart, those are my family. Those are who I consider my soul family. And to me, those are the ones who are far more connected to me than just somebody who is connected because of biological, similarities, biological lines, right? And it's time for us to sort of break that too, to assess every relationship we have, to say, okay, does it serve me to be in this relationship? Do I truly enjoy and resonate with this individual? Or do I just move on? And so why would we give different things to, biological family versus, soul family? Because to me, it's just like, we're all in this for whatever reason. Now, our biological family, we all chose to be biological family for whatever set of purposes, for whatever set of lessons. And at some point, it's okay to say, I think we're done. And yet we still hold on. So think about all this, because everything we hold on to that doesn't resonate with us, it becomes heavier and heavier and heavier with like more and more layers. And so, it's sort of like we start dragging this big bag of this big sack behind us. And the more we go and the more we hold on to, the heavier it becomes. And the less energy we then have to allow ourselves to expand and really be who we came here to be and stuff like that. So it's the same thing like I was saying with relationships and with marriages, right? Because culturally, we had a certain expectation about marriage and what it was. Well, heck, I mean, originally it was to sell a woman as property, which, really doesn't resonate here. you know, um, and things about, being a lifetime thing. Well, okay, what was okay was maybe a lifetime thing when we live to be 30, but when we live to be 90, really? Do we really grow together at the same rate, in the same way, at the same time, like for that long? Some people, yes, but actually pretty few in terms of the bigger picture. And the key is to consistently reassess. So I've worked with a lot of people going through divorces or deciding to go through divorces and coming to me and saying, I want to do it differently because I don't want to get divorced because I hate my spouse. I want to get divorced because I feel like we're done and it's just time for us to both move on, but we're sort of still tied in this because of, this marriage. And so again, it's a cultural habit, it's a cultural expectation, it's a tradition that we perpetuate. And it's like, well, I always say we should just throw the book away, marriage, and rewrite the whole thing to be, like, hey, we're together and we're here on this road together as long as it serves us. And when it doesn't serve us anymore, then it's time to move on with love and gratitude that we were able to do that with each other. So that's sort of a crusade that I have in working with clients and stuff like that I've worked with. I've worked with many uncouplings, I call them. And, tradition, even tradition in our culture, tradition in the way we do things, like when we talk about gender roles, and that's changing pretty slowly, but it's changing. So I can't say it's not. We still have some really deeply ingrained traditions there that still don't serve us, but still drive us, right? I mean, look at within marriage, right? Then we have gender roles. Like, what's the woman supposed to do? What's the man supposed to do? And there are many marriages that still exist, surprisingly, where, the woman took on a certain role because she believed that's what made her valuable as a spouse and then as a mother, right? And then, and they gave up all of who they were because, the cultural expectation, the tradition is the mom's supposed to be the one that sacrifices herself for the kids. The mom's supposed to be the primary caretaker of the kids. And, it's funny because when I had kids, my husband took great offense to that. And he still does. I mean, he would take offense to that because he's like, they're my kids too. And that people would expect that he would know less about his children than me just because he was the father. That really upset him because he wasn't in that traditional mode. Like, he was like, we were partners from the beginning. In fact, if anybody would have he stayed home with our first one for 4 months, and he was fabulous with her. So, and he's fabulous with both of our kids. So, and we were both very much partners, but we still have these traditional expectations, and we get into these habits, and we don't realize how many of our activities are driven by that. Again, same thing with spiritual practices. So the thing is to consistently look at, is this, yes, I love doing this. I love doing whatever that is, doing blank, right? I love going to fire ceremonies or drumming circles or whatever, fill in the blank. But have you become dependent on it as, as a crutch to be your spiritual outlet instead of taking that energy or going beyond it? And knowing that you can go beyond it, that it's simply a tool to help us remember a piece of the whole pie, right? So that's what happens is many people say, well, I've done this practice. I've done shamanic work for 40 years. Have a whole bunch of, somebody will say that and they'll be like, but they have a whole bunch of physical stuff in their body because they're practicing it in this traditional way. And it's like, okay, if that's what you really identify with, that's great, but then change it so that you're not taking it on in your body, because that was the traditional way of practicing shamanic medicine, and taking it out of, or helping somebody take it out of them and then taking it, transmuting it in the body, which has caused a lot of physical stuff in those kind of practices. I had a cat that I used to call my shamanic cat because he would literally come and sit at somebody's feet. And all of a sudden he would just start hacking up stuff. Sometimes he'd throw up and then it would like pull something out of the person. I'm like, seriously, you don't have to do that. He ended up getting a tumor on his butt because he couldn't get it all the way out. But the thing is like, okay, so look at the stuff that you really enjoy, right? And incorporate it into an ever growing, ever expansive presence and practice in not just like a relationship or a belief system or practice, like, or a spiritual practice, but to incorporate it all together and allow it to be a constantly evolving thing. In marriage and parenthood and roles, because roles, many of them are traditional. Like, oh, you're supposed to do this as a spouse, as a wife, as a husband, as a mother, as a father, as a child. You're supposed to do this. Like, how many times do you hear that? You're supposed to do this. Or, that's the biggest challenge that people are having, many are having, as they come into their awakening, and they come into their divine self, or they start to do that, is a lot of people around them become uncomfortable because they step out of the roles that they were expected to be in, and that they accepted within themselves, until they stop accepting them. And that can cause a lot of friction in a household, in a family, in a relationship. But then it just gives the freedom to everybody else. What it does, what I tell people all the time, when I work with them about that, is it helps them to hold the vibration and have others see that it's okay for them to do it too. And then we start breaking the chain. We start breaking the habits. We start breaking the patterns, so that we can literally, stand in truly who we are, instead of just a shadow of tradition and habit and things that weigh heavily on us, but we don't resonate with anymore. So that's really the message for today. The thing to do, and like I guess it does really work well as the holiday season, because many people do certain things that they've done because their family's done them all of their life, or they've done them all their life. And if they don't limit you, that's great. But if they do, and you don't resonate with anymore, just take a look at it, throw it out, find something else, accept something else into your fold, accept someone else into your fold. Accept a way you do things into the fold that, help to be more heart-based. If you feel like you're too mind-based, and mind-based would be, I have to do this and this and this and this and this, and I have a checklist of things I have to do. I have to buy all these people presents, and I have to go and do this, and I have to go and do that. It takes you out of your heart. And anything that takes us out of our heart is counterproductive to our spiritual evolution and expansion. Because when we're in our heart, in a place of love, that's when we're able to step into who we are and be our divine self. And then we very easily can spread that with others and hold that space and give the others around us permission to be in the same place, because it feels good. And we realize that's where we're naturally resonant, right? Is what really, that's where we naturally feel good, is where we are resonant with who we are and what serves us and what expands us. So that's it for today. So look at that this week. Look at all that stuff. Look at everything and look at how everything's being done. And if something is banging up against the wall, you feel like you're banging your head up against the wall about something, you feel like a pit in your stomach because you have to do this. I've got to go to Aunt Mary's Christmas party because I've always had to go. Always look inside. If your body is telling you, like, if you have oh, your stomach's like, oh, I really don't want to go, right? Oh, I really don't want to do this. If your head is just ticking away and not being able to relax in a place of enjoyment and love, then cut it off your list. Yes, will you get some pushback? People will get annoyed, but that doesn't define you. You define you. You allow yourself to be who you are. So that's my Christmas present to you. It's to my holiday, not Christmas, holiday, because it is Hanukkah too right now. So it's the present is to be present with yourself and to really reassess everything and allow yourself to support you over everything else. So that's it for today. This is Angela Coulter signing out. See you next week on Living the Shift. Have a good one.